My name is Dan. I am from Book Yaya. I am a co-founder of Book Yaya along with my wife, Delane, who is usually the moderator tonight. She sends her love and she apologizes that she couldn't be here tonight. We have a magnificent evening tonight. But before we jump in, I want to thank the 3 libraries that partnered with Book Yaya to promote this event: Bedford Hills Free Library, Eastchester Public Library, Briarcliff Manor Public Library. Donna, Shelley, Tracy, Mary, thank you so much for bringing this Book Yaya to your community and partnering with us. It's been just a wonderful experience. I'd like to introduce Libby Copeland. You can see this beautiful book. Okay, Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, the New York Times, the New Republic, Esquire, and the Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, just came out in paperback last month. The Lost Family explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, before you spit in that vial, read this book. The Washington Post says, The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? Please welcome Libby Copeland.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you for this incredible forum. And I'm so thrilled to be here. Dan, thank you for hosting and moderating and stepping in your wife's place and ably doing it. And Dani, I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. So I'm going to read a little from The Lost Family from the very beginning. Just to kind of give you a flavor of the tone of the book and sort of some of the themes that it tackles. This is the story of a woman named Alice, but it is also the story of a man named Jason, and a woman named Jackie, and a whole host of people you haven't yet met, but who could be you. This is about the countless people who have seen ads for at-home DNA tests and, eager to learn about their ancestral heritage, decided those tests looked like fun and got more than they expected. It could be that there's a fundamental fact about you or about your family's past that you don't yet know, and that will change the way you think about truth and family and who you are. The only thing standing between you and the discovery of this story is that DNA test. If the hundreds of Americans I've spoken with are any guide, before you take such a test, you are unlikely to think there's any such disruptive fact in your family history. Even if you know there's a statistical possibility that you'll discover something surprising, you're unlikely to expect that the statistics will apply to you. The problem is, it is impossible to say, in the absence of the inkling of any such surprise, whether or not you'll be better off for knowing this information. And once you know it, it's too late. I came to think of the community of people I encountered researching this book as seekers. They are people obsessed with figuring out just what's in their genes. Not everyone who orders a direct-to-consumer DNA test qualifies as one, though a lot of folks who enter into this casually find themselves unexpectedly captivated by questions they never thought to ask, questions posed by the DNA itself. At-home DNA testing is sometimes called recreational to distinguish it from genetic tests that are ordered by doctors. But its implications can be far more profound than the term recreational implies. The seekers generally fall into one of 3 categories. Some started out as avid genealogists. Before they ever ordered a DNA kit, they were already subscribers to the vast stores of genealogical records at Ancestry.com. Some had already flown out to the Mormon-run Family History Library in Salt Lake City, Utah, and spent a week there, camped out up to their ears in old church records on microfilm. For these people, DNA testing through a company like Ancestry or 23andMe was a logical extension of this deep genealogical curiosity. These folks try to trace their family trees back hundreds of years, using DNA combined with genealogy to suss out the identity of a particular 19th century ancestor or to figure out exactly how they're related to a distant cousin. If elderly relatives have difficulty generating enough saliva to spit into a vial, these seekers know the answer is a slice of lemon. A few, thwarted by the unexpected timing of events, have even resorted to swabbing the insides of their parents' cheeks after death. The second category of seekers is marked by a more immediate and pressing puzzle, brought on, say, by lingering suspicions that the man they call dad might not be their genetic father. Or they might be looking for evidence that they're not related to a family they never felt at home in. Some find their suspicions validated, and others are disabused of them, and some find something else entirely, like a previously unknown half-sibling. Many seekers are adoptees looking for their biological relatives, or people conceived by a sperm donor seeking the stranger who contributed half their genetic material. These seekers join Facebook groups dedicated to the mechanics of what's known as genetic genealogy, learning to talk of haplogroups and centimorgans and triangulation. They sketch countless family trees, trying to figure out where they might fit into them. They call their hobby an addiction. They read tips on how to phrase letters of introduction to their fathers, a topic so fraught and fascinating for what it reveals about the vagaries of human nature and the complications of the human heart that it deserves a dissertation or three. The third category of people have no inkling they're about to find anything surprising, and this is often the most disruptive way in which DNA testing plays out. These people do not start out as seekers. Instead, they test to find out if that old story of a Native American ancestor is true. They test because they want to know whether they're like that guy in the Ancestry DNA commercial who thought he was one thing and turned out to be another. "I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt," he declares, happy in his certainty. They test because they got a kit as a gift for Christmas, and then Easter dinner becomes awkward because the test has revealed something strange. Perhaps a family's understanding of its heritage is muddied by a pie chart offering one's ethnicity estimate, and the question, "Why is it saying I'm half Greek?" becomes a curiosity, which becomes a nagging doubt, which becomes a family conversation no one will ever forget. Then these people too become obsessives, trying to solve the mystery, finding possible relatives through Google and Facebook searches, and then offering to buy and ship DNA kits to those people if they'll agree to test. Well, some of them do. Some of them presumably back away slowly, like a hiker who spies an old grenade from a long ago war on a beach. These people don't tell their stories. Who could blame them? These people don't have stories. They have DNA results they'd rather not have seen, and which they may prefer not to believe. The seekers filled my inbox and my ears over the last few years with their questions. What sense could they make of a secret kept for so many decades? How much of the past did they need to go back and footnote in light of this new knowledge? How many conversations were, in retrospect, lies of omission? And how now to treat the strangers who'd come abruptly into their lives, these strangers with whom they share genetic material? Are these people family? And if not, do we need a new category to describe them? Is it always better to know that these genetic relatives exist? Is it always better to know the truth? Should they invite the truth over for Thanksgiving? Secrets we are all discovering have a propulsive power all their own, and time and complicity only make them more powerful. Once you decide to keep a secret, the secret maintains a circular logic, even when circumstances change. Many seekers say the fact of the secret is a thing that nags at them, more than the nature of the secret itself. DNA testing has brought the past forward to the present, forcing us to grapple with decisions made long ago in different, often desperate circumstances. It forces us to think about the people whose truths have been hushed up for decades, the teenager, for instance, consigned to a home for unwed mothers. Some seekers are in their 80s and 90s, just discovering siblings they've spent their lives without. Some are left with only questions, and there's no one left to ask. "I had no clue I was adopted," says a seeker named Linda, who discovered this blunt fact at the age of 51 through a DNA test. When Linda figured out the identity of her biological mother using puzzle-solving techniques well known in this world, she learned the woman had just passed away, and that she would never have answers to certain things. Linda asked, "Did she ever think of me? Did she ever look for me?" And that's just a little bit from the beginning of the book.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. Yay. Dani Shapiro, let me take my glasses. Dani Shapiro is the author of the instant New York Times bestselling memoir, Inheritance, which was published in January 2019 by Knopf. Her other books include memoirs Hourglass, Still Writing, Devotion, and Slow Motion, and 5 novels, including Black and White and Family History. Along with teaching writing workshops around the world, Dani has taught at Columbia and New York University and is the co-founder of the Siren Land Writers Conference in Positano, Italy. Beautiful. In February of 2019, Dani launched an original podcast, Family Secrets, in collaboration with iHeartMedia. An iTunes Top 10 podcast, the series features stories from guests who, like Dani, have uncovered life-altering and long-hidden secrets from their family's past. She lives with her family in Litchfield County, Connecticut. Please help me welcome the wonderful Dani Shapiro.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for hosting Libby and myself on this wonderful platform that you've built. It's amazing, and Libby, it's such a treat to be with you. I was just sitting here rapt listening to your reading. So I'm going to read a little bit of the way into Inheritance, but before I do, I just want to say that, as will become very clear, I fall into the third category of seeker that Libby was listing there. I took a home DNA test for recreational reasons on the suggestion of my husband, with no interest or curiosity. There are many varieties of shock. This is something you don't know until you've experienced a few of them. I've been on the other end of a phone call, hearing the news that my parents were in a car crash and both might not live. I've sat in a doctor's office being told that my baby boy had a rare and often fatal disease. I have felt the slam, the blade, the breathless falling, a physical sense of being shoved backward into an abyss. But this was something altogether different. An air of unreality settled like a cloak around me. I was stupid, disbelieving. The air became thick sludge. Nothing computed. Maybe they got it wrong. Michael just looked at me. Switched vials, mislabeled the results. It was the thinnest of threads, but it was all I had. Human error. It seemed possible in that moment that all of this would turn out to be a big mistake, something that would become a crazy story I'd tell someday after I recovered from this needless distress. Let me see if I can get someone on the phone, Michael said. He paused at my office door. You okay? I'm fine. My voice was reedy, stretched taut. Alone in my office, I went back to ordinary things with a vengeance. I should interject here, I was packing for a trip we were taking the next morning. I unplugged my phone charger from the wall and wrapped the wires neatly around it. I packed my travel-sized toiletries and checked them off the list. I looked up the San Francisco weather and folded an extra sweater into my bag. Estimated number of generations to MRCA equals 4.5. Susie and I were 4.5 generations away from a most recent common ancestor. That is my who I believe to be my half sister. At first, this didn't seem like a lot of generations, but within a single ethnic group like Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, by 4.5 generations, just about everyone has an ancestor in common. Close relatives, parents, uncles, aunts, first, second, even third and fourth cousins are pinpointed by DNA testing sites with a degree of precision. If two people share a father, the results would be resoundingly clear. Susie and I were not related. Somewhere within me, in a place as dangerous and electric as a live wire, I knew what this meant. If it was true. If it was true being something that I would repeat to myself again and again. If it was true being something I might always cling to in a disbelieving, childlike way, part of the thick sludge.
I just need my phone.
If it was true that Susie and I were not half sisters, my father was not my father. That he was Susie's father was without question. She looked like him. She had his eyes and the shape of his face. She even sounded a bit like him. Her cadences, those of a born and bred yeshiva-educated New Yorker. I, on the other hand, looked nothing like my father or anyone in his family. I was pale-skinned, very blonde, blue-eyed. All my life, I'd fielded and deflected comments about not looking Jewish, but I had no reason to question my biological connection to my dad. He was my dad. But now, in a minefield of doubt, there was no doubt in my mind about Susie's paternity, only mine. The more chaotic my thoughts became, the more precise my actions, as if carefully folded t-shirts and jeans might fix everything. I could hear Michael's voice downstairs. Had he gotten someone on the phone at this hour? Where was Ancestry.com even located? I imagined a massive warehouse full of thousands of plastic vials. I was trying to think it all through, but with a mind blunted as if by a sledgehammer blow. Vladimir Nabokov, in Speak Memory, ponders the question of how to examine a deluded mind when one's only resource is a deluded mind. I picked my way through the little I knew. First of all, that business about being 52% Eastern European Ashkenazi in the DNA analysis, that was ridiculous. Of course, I was entirely Jewish. My parents were both Jewish. I had been raised Orthodox. I mean, I was very Jewish. I spoke fluent Hebrew until I was in high school. I'd always countered the litany of questions about my ethnicity with a recital of my impeccable family history. That plastic vial must have been accidentally switched with that of some half-Jewish person who was at this very moment confused about her own DNA. My results had also listed a first cousin who was unfamiliar to me. There he was, a blue icon, like the one that might be found on a door to a men's room, identified only by his initials. This, Michael will later tell me, set off loud, clanging warning bells for him. But not for me. Obviously, I knew all of my first cousins. This only reinforced my certainty that there must be some mistake. I ran through the facts of my own identity again and again as if memorizing a poem or factors of an equation. By the time Michael came back upstairs, it was nearly midnight. We were leaving for the airport in 4 hours. I was freezing. He wrapped his arms around me, but not before I saw the look on his face. I registered that I had never seen him look at me that way before. Not when my mother died, not when our boy was sick. I would describe it as something bordering on pity. It wasn't so much my future that was being irrevocably altered by this discovery. It was my past. Michael had already known this, of course, well before he looked up the toll-free number on Ancestry's website. He had known when he first saw the surprising breakdown of my ethnicity, when a first cousin who was a stranger had appeared along with my results like an emissary from some foreign world. It's not a mistake, he said softly. In the ensuing weeks, every person I tell about this will say a version of the same thing. Must be a mix-up. It can't be true. They will say it protectively, indignantly. They will say it out of kindness, and they will be wrong. Millions of people have had their DNA tested by Ancestry.com, and no such mistake had ever been made.
So fabulous. Such a moving dissection of the moments right after, right? And, this is a phenomenon that has happened to well over 1 million people at this point. And what I love about this chapter is that it, you in Dani's story, you get a lot of other stories. I mean, there's a lot of people who call up Ancestry and think their vial got swapped with someone else's. And what I wanted to ask you, Dani, is sometimes when I talk to people who have not had a DNA surprise, or it hasn't happened to someone close to them, which is an increasingly smaller world of people, they sort of say, what's the big deal, right? Like, your father's still your father. The guy who raised you is your dad. You're still you, right? And the thing that people can struggle to get across is the bigness of this, the profundity of it. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, both in its short term, and I know it's something that you carry obviously with you now and will always. And so I wonder if you could talk about the bigness of the impact of a revelation.
Absolutely. So I would begin by sort of, in a way, dividing the idea of a discovery. It really, at its core, has to do with identity. And our identities, which we don't really often have cause to think about, which is why some people have such a hard time wrapping their minds around this, our identities are formed by the stories we're told about ourselves from the time that we can understand story from the time that we are very small children. And so, for example, if someone is adopted, the story that they're told from the time that they're very small children, hopefully, if their parents are doing what is, what is the psychologically, known thing to do, it's always been woven into their identities that they are not a biological child of their parents. And so being an adoptee, while complicated, is part of their story. It's part of their identity. If you're raised in a biological family, those stories are also part of your identity being formed from the time you're very small. And it's things like, oh, she has, Aunt Ethel's eyes, or, he walks just like Uncle Isaac, or whatever it is. And there is an assumed and understood and felt familiarity between a child growing up in a biological family and that biological family. Fine. We don't even, again, we do not think about it. When you are someone who has what's known in the this world now as a non-parental event, if you are not your father's biological child, or more recently your mother's biological child due to egg donation, or you are adopted and were never told, as in late discovery adoptees, you grow up, I won't speak in general, I grew up, except that is an utterly universal experience, what I'm about to describe. I grew up sensing something off, not knowing what it was, what I alluded to in my reading of people constantly feeling moved to tell me that I didn't look like my father's family, or that I didn't look like the ethnicity that I was so deeply rooted in. That was very confusing. I dug in. I doubled down when people would say that to me. I was like, yeah, raised Orthodox yeshiva, 2 sinks, 2 dishwashers, without ever entertaining the conscious thought, why are they saying that? And maybe there's something there. Why do I feel like I don't quite fit in or belong? Maybe I should look into this, but I never did, because it never occurred to me to, because I was so utterly identified with being my parents' biological child, because that was the identity that was given to me. So I think for all of the, over 1 million people who are making these discoveries, the world rockingness of it is not simply biology or genetics. So many people who haven't read my book initially misunderstand and think what I'm saying is that nature is all that matters. And that is most definitely not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that the secrecy, I think at its core, and it having been, just at the most fundamental level of human rights, we are entitled to know who and where we come from, if that's knowable, on so many levels. I mean, medical among them, but many other psychological, spiritual, emotional levels. So I think that's my somewhat long unpacked answer to why it matters so much. But I'm curious to ask you, because I've been on my own in a way. I mean, you wrote this as a journalist. From the time that Inheritance was published in the winter of 2019, I, in a way, became a journalist of this, not just of my own story, but of the hundreds and hundreds and thousands of stories of people who would then come to my events or write to me or reach out to me, who were also being impacted in some way or another by such a discovery. So, to go back to something that you just read from, what I mean, it's not a simple question, but have you experienced a commonality in the emotional and psychological impact of making a discovery like this?
Definitely. Definitely. And, it goes back to what you were saying about storytelling, and we define ourselves through the stories we tell about ourselves. And when you're once upon a time, your origins change. It doesn't stay discreetly tucked into the beginning of your story. It impacts the rest of your story, right? It completely changes the context for everything that happens after. You can't tell the story of yourself when you don't know how it starts. And when you discover that there's this radically different beginning, it has all these kind of ripple effects, right? It has implications for your trust in your parents, your relationship with them. It contextualizes memories that never made sense, and explains them. It sometimes pulls up old memories. Like I've had people tell me that they didn't think of things forever. Like something happened when a stray remark their mom made when they were 6 years old. And they never thought of it. And then they got this surprise, and they flashed back to something their mother said, or their father said, or a neighbor kid teasing them. And they suddenly could put their finger on why that happened. For many people, it contextualizes as well a feeling of otherness, a feeling of outsiderness, which is what you were describing. There's a number of people describe this to me as a trauma. I don't feel like I'm going out on a limb by saying that. That was the description of people who had experienced a non-parental event, right? Which is the discovery one or both your parents isn't genetically related to you, sometimes through donor conception, sometimes because they're adopted and they weren't told, or even the discovery that their roots were hidden from them, right, for historical reasons, because their families assimilated their way out of their roots because they wanted to escape discrimination, right? So there's all these kind of different ways that it can play out. Or there can be the discovery of a previously unknown like half sibling because your dad had a relationship back in high school and that person pops up on the data, in the DNA matches. But the discovery, particularly that your own genetic roots aren't what you thought, over and over again was described as a trauma. And I interviewed a number of therapists this had happened to, and they used that term. And then they often described a sense of profound disorientation. I found that really interesting. And there was one description that I heard over and over again so many times that I came up with a name for it. I call it the lonely boat metaphor. And that is when you suddenly discover that you are not tethered to the biological roots you thought you were tethered to, and that there's some unknown folks out there in the world, some strangers that you are genetically related to. And it is a sense of being adrift. It is a sense of being rootless. I think we, even before we were in this like heavily genealogical era, and even before, 40 million people had taken a DNA test, right? We identify ourselves through what we know of the past, so all the ways in which the past shaped us and how we came to be in this place, right? And the family stories and the family narratives, and the family lore that we cling to. So to have that all suddenly stripped away is to suddenly not know where you are on this earth. And one woman described it to me. She said, I felt like I had been placed on a raft and pushed out to sea. And another woman said, I felt completely adrift. I felt like I didn't know who I was. And that's not to say that you stay in that state, because then, and part of the reason I call the people in my book seekers, because then you start the process of discovery. Okay, so I'm not exactly what I thought I was. My story wasn't the right story. My story wasn't the truth. What is the truth? And that process of truth seeking is something you are seeing on a monumental scale across families and across our culture right now. I mean, I really think we're in a unique cultural moment. We're going to look back, we're going to say, oh, wow, that's the era when family secrets died. That was the moment of intergenerational reckoning, when parents changed the way they talked to their children, when they realized they couldn't not tell them certain key facts, because whether or not they told them, the DNA tests were going to reveal it for them. So they'd better, get in front of it. So all of, it's kind of an amazing cultural moment we're in. And I just think we need to be like, kind of talking about it, right? And maybe normalizing it to the extent that we can for the people who are going through this, so that they know that they're not alone. And your book certainly did a ton of that, right? I mean, I think so many people probably thought they were alone before they read that. So I guess I'm wondering, one of the things that that interests me is this idea that that culture changes really rapidly, and that you look back 60, 70 years, maybe it doesn't seem so long ago, and then the DNA test kind of reveals the ways in which the culture has changed radically, and we sort of slam with our truth seeking, whether or not we intend to be truth seeking, we sort of slam into the realities of the past. And I guess I was wondering if you could talk about, there are certain old taboos about how children came into the world that maybe are less stigmatized now, and yet those taboos kind of hang on, um, and there's never the right moment, perhaps, for parents to reveal to their children how they came into the world, even though the culture around them has radically changed, right? And I guess I was wondering if you could talk about the force of those old taboos and the emotions that are rooted, in them, and how you see that playing out now in families, that you're talking to.
Yeah, I love what you said about this being a kind of extraordinary societal and cultural reckoning. I've been aware of that for the last few years. I think of it as a seam in time that is going to end. There's going to be a point where all of these discoveries have been made. We're nowhere near the tipping point right now, but there will be a point where we look back and it will be like, how did we ever think that that was okay?
Yeah.
How did we ever think it was okay to hide, obscure a child's identity from them? And, one of the things I was thinking as you were speaking is that the families who, in certain cases where this was a choice, the families who chose not to reveal to their children the truth of their genetic identity, whether through adoption or through, sperm or egg donation. It was very important to those families to feel like a family. And for the parents, it was a feeling of probably some degree of being frightened that their child wouldn't feel like a part of their family if they knew the truth or whatever it was. But, one of the things I saw from the very first night that I gave my very first reading from Inheritance, which was at a bookstore on the Upper East Side in New York City. First of all, I walked in and it was like mobbed. And I thought, wow, it was the day the book came out. What's going on? And it was people who were not my usual, they didn't look like my fan demographic. There were elderly men, there were couples kind of sitting there holding hands with each other, like, maybe in their 50s or 60s or 70s. There were young people. There was like and I was up there and I remember that night as I was reading and talking, kind of scanning the crowd. And it's almost like I had radar and I thought, 80-something-year-old gentleman in the back row, you donated sperm. And now you're wondering
Yes.
whether, the chickens are going to come home to roost. It's a terrible metaphor, but I just used it. Or, you couple in the third row holding hands who look stricken, you have a grown child or a teenage child who doesn't know that they are the product of a sperm donation or an egg donation. And you're realizing that they're going to find out.
Yes.
And then there was this whole range of people who looked literally like they were radiating so much pain. And, you used the word trauma, I would use it too, that they were practically like levitating with it. And I thought, you are all people who have just made this discovery and you are on your lonely raft right now. And you came to this event so that you would feel like maybe you could hook up some rafts with some other people. And that's been my experience since day one, and to this day, is that there's a reckoning going on. And the family secret of this kind, whether it was an affair or even a completely unknown child, or or using a sperm donor, or using an egg donor, that is going to be a thing of the past. but it isn't right now. It's still going on. So, and that's where we are. And I think that's where we're going to be probably for another, I don't know, like decade or more. But I'm wondering, you know, I mean, one of the questions that you pose in your book is it always better to know the truth? And I am a firm believer that it is, even when it's really hard, because the lights switch on. You know, as you were saying, it's like the lights switch on, and long ago conversations, long ago memories emerge, and we become less mysterious to ourselves, even if we hadn't realized we were mysterious to ourselves. And so I'm wondering what you think.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've interviewed and corresponded with hundreds of people, and there is a kind of a bifurcation between where you stand in the relationship to the secret that's being revealed that determines how you feel about it. Not the secret nature of the secret, not the degree of pain of it. If you're discovering something about your own genetic origins, the trend seems to be, from everyone I talk to, you are glad to know the truth, even when it's painful, even when maybe the circumstances of your own conception involved coercion or violence. Really difficult circumstances, right? Even when your parents are no longer alive and you can't even ask them questions for context, over and over people said they were glad to know. Why? Because it was the truth. Because it was about themselves. Because all the other things we were talking about, right? Putting your life in context. Because once you know, then you can go about the process of healing, frankly, you know, and frankly, there's been a rise of mental health professionals who are emerging to kind of thread the needle for people, to kind of, you know, help them with something that's somewhat unprecedented. I mean, there have always been questions about parentage and paternity if you go back through time, but the phenomenon on a scale like this has emerged in the last 10 years. If you think about it, like 10 years ago, there wasn't a thing of misattributed parentage revelations emerging from DNA testing, right? That just didn't exist. So, you know, that's a radical thing that's happening in a very short amount of time. And thankfully, there are mental health professionals who are starting to recognize that. But it's not always that way for the people who are on the other side of the secret keepers. It's not always that way, right? The older generation, and I think that has to do with a couple of things. I mean, one is it's a threat to your narrative. You know, it's a threat to your own self-conception. To, for instance, maybe you're a man who you're in your 80s and you conceived a child and you never knew it, and you never were able to have a relationship with or help out with caring for that child, and you might feel incredible shame and guilt about that, right? And you think of yourself as a good guy, and you are a good guy, right? But that is just too much. It is too much of a threat to your understanding of yourself, or your spouse is threatened by it, or your child is threatened by it. You know, there's a kind of a fear of the stranger who comes in this context. You know, the intimate stranger, the person to whom biology says you might owe something, but circumstances say you owe nothing. And people tend to get their backs up about that. And there's often a scenario where say the father and his family, the biological father who's being approached, will say, like, what do you want? There's an assumption that the person coming into their lives maybe wants to be written into their will. And in all my interviews, you know, I pretty much never encounter that, right? People want, seekers want acceptance. They want to be kind of validated. They want to have a relationship. They want to learn more about themselves if they can, through learning about their biological kin. But they're often suspected of having ulterior motives, and that's like really painful. So yeah, I mean, how you feel about this depends on where you stand in relationship to it and what that revelation means. You know, sometimes a sibling can feel like this, you know, much older half sister who's coming into her life saying, "Oh my gosh, your dad and my dad are the same person, and he had me in high school." they can really feel like that's butting up against a sacred narrative that they have about their father, and perhaps his loyalty to their mother, or just his character. And that's where you see a lot of the fathers and sisters and brothers and mothers who, who kept secrets, or just discovering secrets that are not about them, but about maybe someone that they love, or their own past actions, kind of shut down and delete their kits, and have their attorneys get involved with sending letters saying, don't contact me anymore, or you must have the wrong person. And I should say, just to kind of establish this, the DNA matches when they tell you that you're related to someone in the DNA database. That's very reliable science. It's not the same as the ethnicity estimates, which are estimates and should be taken with a grain of salt, particularly within close relatives. When something, you take an ancestry DNA test and someone shows up as parent-child, that's not something that, it could be a first cousin relationship and they messed it up. It's just not. So, so that's the new world in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're going to open it up to questions, and there are going to be a ton of them. But what you just said about the it depending on where you stand in relation to the secret, I have seen so much as well, and also I think it's a primal, primitive response when you have a family. You're done. You know what it is. These are the tent poles of your identity, and someone comes along and says, not so fast, or this turns out to be the case. Almost every story that I have heard, including my own initially, the first feeling is, what do you want? And because it's so primal and primitive, and we're human beings, the first thought is, like, even people who, I've heard a story of someone who was a very, very wealthy person discovering a biological parent who was not wealthy at all, and still the non-wealthy parent was like, "What do you want? You want my money?" It's just, and the last thing I'll say is, I think at its bedrock, it's an ethical question. Because these are unintended consequences that science has, brought on. And, these men who donated sperm, these parents who were told never to tell anyone, they were told that during a time when this did not exist. And then there are all of the children who are born of that time, who didn't ask to be born in that way, conceived in that way, who didn't sign anything, who are reeling, who are on their lonely boats. And, when I was on tour, I ended up speaking in bioethics departments at a number of universities around the country. And at one of them, it was actually at Johns Hopkins, I brought up to the head of the program, I said, I know this is probably not an ethical term, but I think we owe each other kindness. Mm. And she said, oh, but kindness is an ethical term.
Mm. Yeah.
So I think I'll leave it at that.
I love that.
Yeah.
Wow. Magnificent. What an incredible conversation. I can only imagine what your Q&As are like on this. The people just must come from everywhere with stories, incredible stories. So I want to thank you. I did figure out how to spotlight the two of you. And I want to open it up to conversation, questions. If anybody has a question, and I'm going to go into the chat right now. And I see that Larissa had a question. Larissa, you can unmute yourself. And if you don't, yeah, there you go. Great.
Thank you. I immigrated from Russia 40 plus years ago. And I know that I have family in this country because my great-grandparents came here and some left, some stayed. My father left, his brother stayed. So I know that they're in America. I've been here for like 43 years now. I don't want anything from anybody. I just want to find that family. But I took the DNA test on Ancestry and they gave me hundreds, maybe thousands of matches. I have no idea where to start. I can't imagine how to even start. What would be the MCRI for close relative? Is there a number? I don't know where to start. Can you help me with that?
So I can say neither Dani or I are genealogists. So, but I can say in general terms, when you get that list, and sometimes it's tens of thousands of people long, the people at the very top are the most closest related to you, and you don't even need to worry about the distance to most recent common ancestor and in most immediate terms when you're looking at that, because it's going to tell you if you have a first cousin, that is like a gold mine, right? And on Ancestry, which is a pretty big database at this point, a lot of people are finding first cousins and closer. Then what you're doing, let's say it's not a first cousin, let's say you didn't hit the jackpot, let's say you found a second cousin once removed, and it'll kind of give you a sense. You can't always predict the precise nature of the relationship, but what they're detecting is overlapping genetic segments, and they're able to tell you the degree of relatedness. And then you're reaching out, if you can, and you're asking to see their tree. And sometimes with Ancestry, people wind up subscribing because they're wanting to see trees and they're wanting to do research. And then this is the painstaking part, is to kind of compare trees, compare surnames, compare hometowns in the old country, right? And try to figure out what is the common ancestor that you are sharing with those people. And that's the hard work. Honestly, like the DNA test is both can be really like the big deal, and also can be in some ways the easy part. It's like the what's then, what comes next, that can be like a ton of work. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Larissa. Robin Swartz, did you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hi, Dani, I read your book, right before COVID, I guess, because I went to your writer's block event in LA, which was great. And I have no, history of anything like this. I've wanted to do a DNA test. Libby, I started listening to your book earlier today, and then just the prologue made me think, no, maybe not. But I'm curious because I did just have to do a genealogy test for just a genetic test. And I wanted to know, like, does that open up like the database? Like, can people access that, or is that supposed to be kept private because it's, for medical purposes, if there's, cancer in the family or some other illness?
So it sounds like you took it through a medical office.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, for like a medical, it's Myriad Labs in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is ironic, I think, because that is where the Mormon church has the big.
If that's not in a direct to consumer context, like it's something that your doctor ordered, then that should be protected by privacy laws like HIPAA that protect your medical information in general.
Right. Okay. And then the other thing, because I haven't gotten far enough in your book, Libby. I mean, Dani's was fascinating, and I just, obviously so unexpected, and it was such an enthralling book. But Libby, I was curious if a cousin of mine does take a DNA test, somebody could track me down, like as, a possible, like if my father, who was single most of his life, was only married to my mom a short time, if my father had fathered a child and just one of my cousins has taken a DNA test, could I be found that way? Or I would have to be, they would have to talk to the cousin and then it would lead to me possibly?
Yeah, so the tipping point, the sort of astonishing fact about DNA testing is because we share overlapping genetic segments, you don't have to be in the database in order to be potentially identifiable to someone who is related to you and looking for you. And so that means that we are all implicated by this technology. We're all potentially affected by it because we are close to 40 million people in the databases, and most of those are Americans. And that means almost the entire population of the US is effectively opted in the sense that there's no more family secrets. So let's say that you are looking for your genetic father and he's never taken a DNA test. Doesn't matter. You can trace his identity from a second, even a couple of third cousin matches. But nowadays people are easily getting first cousin matches and closer half sisters. And so if you're willing to put in some genealogical work, yes, you can figure out their identities. So, that's not always the case. They have to kind of have a question that they're trying to answer, and they might need to know to look. So I hope that answers your question, and kind of gives you a sense of both. I don't know if it's reassuring. I mean, I find some of these reunions are incredible, right? And I think there's a lot of ways in which we can be optimistic about this, because I think, you know, we're kind of bringing the human family together, and there's a lot of like incredible, heartwarming stories. But I know some people also, they have privacy concerns and they worry about, you know, how is it that I can be affected even though I've never taken a test? And so there's a bit of a yin yang to this era that we're in.
Interesting. Thank you.
Andrea Carla Michaels, would you like to unmute?
Yes. And excuse me for leaving on my picture, but I just got out of the shower. I was just wondering, and maybe you've answered this, but Dani, if your biological father had been Jewish, just not the father you thought, you never would have known, right? Or would you still have been able to find out because this other cousin popped up? Because that's what I'm most curious about. Like you would never have even known if it came back 100% Jewish.
Well, but no, as you said, the first cousin appearing, who was someone who was not known to me as a first cousin,
Right.
would have been puzzling. So, I mean, look, when I first, saw the ethnic breakdown, I really didn't think anything of it. I even thought, well, maybe all Jews are 50%. There was the diaspora, there were pogroms. I didn't, that was not the big clue for me. The big clue was the first cousin, which I think is the case with most people, is that suddenly there's something there that is a close match, or even, just someone unfamiliar that doesn't make sense.
Okay, thank you.
Varian Schaefer, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yes. Hi. Yes, my name's Varian Schaefer, and within the last, it's been almost 2 years, my children asked me to give them DNA tests for Christmas, so I bought one too, just for fun. And guess what? There showed up someone that said close family relative, and I had no idea because they had a screen name, not their real name. So through lots of research, because you always presume maybe there's another half sibling out there. My father had been married 3 times, all that. So ultimately, I asked my half sister, who we shared the same father, to get a DNA test. She didn't want to do it, but she did. And she got the results back, and she came over here to my house, and we cried all day because she told me that we weren't related. And so after pursuing that on Facebook and Google, these screen names that I found, I finally discovered that night, because I didn't sleep all night, that I had the niece was on Facebook. And then in the middle of this big family gathering was this little old couple. And it was like I couldn't breathe, because it was my father. And I had no idea. I'm 68 years old, that I had a living father. And anyway, it is a happy, happy, happy story, because it took him a while to adjust to it, but everyone has embraced me and loved me. And that thing you talked about, Dani, about the other, about being on the outside, and I never knew why. And I have a half sister that we never looked alike. All of those things you just said, exactly my story. But it's such a happy outcome, and I'm so thankful.
I'm so glad.
Well, thank y'all for doing this. It's just really, like everything you said just hit home so much.
I think people shouldn't feel like they're alone
Yes.
when they go through this stuff. I think people describe to me a lot of sometimes like embarrassment or guilt or shame or whatever, the feelings of being alone and not knowing what to make of it. And so I was
concerned about my mother's reputation. Is that crazy? But but she's dead. So I finally got over that. So thank y'all.
Dani, I'm Jewish as well, and it's so interesting in the Jewish community. There are divisions, and some people have like different, and you grew up Orthodox, and was there ever any kind of a conversation or feelings in the community about questions about your Jewishness?
Well, I mean, interestingly, no, because technically, My mother was Jewish, and she was my biological mother. So many people tried to reassure me very sweetly, but unnecessarily, at the beginning of this discovery, you're still Jewish, your mother's Jewish, Jewish mother, Jewish child. And that did not really have very much impact on me, because my connection to my Jewishness, like on a soul level, was my dad. So I've had to have my own, I've kind of gone through my own journey in terms of feeling like I couldn't care less that I'm half Jewish. Like from where I sit now, 5 years after my discovery, the fact that my biological father's, ancestors, well, my ancestors, came over on the Mayflower, like literally, like you cannot make this stuff up. But it just explains certain things. It explains why I look the way that I do. It explains certain things about my constitution that didn't make sense to me, coming from the two parents who I thought were my biological parents, and now it does. But it doesn't change my relationship to my Jewishness, except perhaps to deepen it, because I had been alienated for so long, for my whole life, by people telling me you can't possibly be Jewish. And meanwhile, I was like so deeply rooted in my Jewish identity, not religion, but in my identity. And I didn't understand why. My son is at a very woke university. And I remember when we were moving him in, there was a bulletin board outside of his, in his dorm that said, like, things that are okay to ask, things that are not okay to ask. And one of the things that it was not okay to ask another person is, if you want to lecture, I'm going to leave right now.
Sorry.
Bye. Where are you from? Just where are you from? That's not a cool thing to ask. And I was asked that my whole life.
Wow. Let me just see this one other.
Dan, I have a question.
Okay, come on in, Irene.
Hi. Hi, Dani. And hi, Libby. My question is, I was adopted when I was 6. I found my birth mother when I was 80. Not really, she died, but I found a half sister. And my sister she did not believe that we could possibly be related. And it turned out that they both grew up in the Bronx, and I lived in Yonkers, very close. My birth mother had 12 brothers and sisters. And this was a big family. And after DNA, I didn't do too much more. I said, okay, I got some answers. And I did meet my half sister, and she came to New York a few times. But we have no closeness, really. We speak to each other weekly, but we led different lives. And she had my mother. I didn't have her. My mother gave me up when I was 1 month old. And when my parents told me that I was adopted, I said, it's not who births you, it's who brings you up. But I never asked them a question after that. It was like the door was closed. Dani and Libby, I have a question. Do you ever really feel satisfied? I mean, I know there are a lot more questions and answers that can come, but it's rather difficult at this point in time.
I know, I understand. Irene, right?
Yes.
My mother's name.
Oh, okay.
So I guess I would say that for the rest of my life, I will continue to unpack this in some way, but it's not haunting me. I feel liberated by it in a lot of ways because I know the truth. And the fact that I didn't know the truth did haunt me, even though I didn't know what I was being haunted by. And there's something very, there's something very liberating about that. In a way, I mean, Inheritance is my 10th book, and all of my books prior, in some way or another, dealt with secrets, with family secrets, my novels, my memoirs. I was always digging for what I did not know. I just knew that there was something that didn't make sense to me that I was looking for. And then it made sense. And even though it was hard, I was grateful for it because, you know, as Libby said, it was like that clarity of, oh, suddenly these pieces of the puzzle are coming together. And I think that, you know, when you find out a secret is in a way as important as what you find out, in the same way as where you stand in relation to the secret is also how you're going to connect to it. And so, you know, either the older you are or the younger you are, that can be really challenging. You can find it out in a vulnerable time. You can find it out when there isn't that much more that you can learn. But I still have got to believe that, like, for me, this is all I can really say, is that at the end of my life, if it's true that we can look back at our lives and have a moment at the moment of our deaths of like seeing it all, if I had missed it, I think I would feel like, oh, wow, I missed that. So that's for me how I ended up feeling about this. Is I'm very glad I know, and I also do think that there will be layers that keep on unfolding.
That's such
Thank you.
I love the way you put that. I mean, I'll add on that that when I was reporting the lost family, I would talk to people right away when they made their discovery, and then again 6 months later, and then 6 months later, and then a year later, and it changed. You know, they came to a place of peace with it, and they needed to make sense of it, and that's such an important thing. You can't just like find this thing and then you drop it. You need to understand the context, which means probably researching your family and maybe reaching out. But regardless, we are all seekers in the sense that we want to know more, right? You need to understand the context. That's just a human thing, to understand the motivation, how this happened, maybe why we weren't told. In order to move past it, you have to know what you're looking at. And over and over, I would talk to people and I would watch them as they were going through the process, and they would tell me how they were doing. And sometimes within a few years, they would describe a very different place than they had been in the very first time I spoke with them. So it's you know, this is not instant, you know, clarity and you know, rainbows and unicorns, but I think it's an extremely necessary process to move through.
I'm going to wrap it up with that. This has been really a magnificent evening. If everybody would unmute themselves and give a little applause.
Thank you so much.
And I just want to thank Bedford Hills Free Library, Eastchester Public Library, and Briarcliff Manor Public Library again for helping, partnering with Bookie Eye and putting this event together. With Dani Shapiro and Libby Copeland, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you.
This was such a treat.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you, Dani.
Thank you.